Chapter 15. Paul hunts the giant moose. Paul Bunyan was not only the greatest logger in the country, he was also a mighty hunter. He could walk for weeks without tiring and could track down the wildest animal. One day, Paul had shot a large grizzly bear just for practice. He followed the bear tracks back through the woods and over the mountains to the very spot where the bear was born. One winter, the men discovered huge tracks in the snow near the camp on Tadpole Creek. They thought at first it was Babe, but Babe had not been away from camp all day. They showed Paul the giant tracks in the snow. "It's a giant moose!" cried Paul Bunyan. No one in the West had ever seen the giant moose of the Rockies, although many woodsmen had seen his tracks in the snow. The tracks were so large and so far apart that nobody could follow them. Paul called for his gun. He said he would follow the giant moose and find him if he had to hunt all winter. Bidding farewell to his men, bidding farewell to his men, he took with him only Elmer, his famous moose hound, and strode off through the forest. Elmer was a strange dog. It seems that one day an axeman had thrown a sharp double-bitted axe at a tree. It missed the tree and hit Elmer, cutting the dog right down the middle. Paul rushed over and quickly sewed the dog back together again, but in the excitement, he sewed the rear part on upside down. Elmer soon was good as ever again, but his two hind legs pointed straight up in the air. This really wasn't so bad, though, because Elmer ran along nicely on his front legs, and then when he became tired, he would turn over and run on his hind legs. In that way, he could run for miles and miles without becoming weary. Night and day, Paul followed the tracks of the giant moose. Over mountains and across rivers, he followed the giant tracks, but the moose always kept ahead of him. Far away in Canada, Paul caught a glimpse of the giant moose drinking at a lake. Before he could draw his gun, the moose leaped over the low range of mountains and was far away. Paul followed him to Alaska and back again down the Pacific coast. The giant moose was becoming tired. Every day, Paul was closer at his heels. To save himself, the giant moose dived into Puget Sound and swam swiftly away. Paul plunged in after him. On and on they went, far up into the mountains. It was summer before Paul finally caught sight of him again. His giant antlers were caught in a narrow pass between two mountain ranges. Unable to move, he stood there bellowing with rage. His huge hoofs churned the ground and threw up tons of dirt. He pawed up dirt and rocks until a mountain arose behind him. It is there to this day that we call it Mount Rainier. Paul raised his gun and drew careful aim. The giant moose struggled in vain. Bang! The first shot went through the heart. Paul Bunyan had come to the end of his hunt, and the giant moose of the Rockies was dead. Chapter 16. The Last Camp of Paul Bunyan. It was late in the summer when Paul and his faithful moose hound, Elmer, started back to Paul's camp on Tadpole Creek. Paul was tired after hunting the giant moose. In spite of his great size, he could average only 40 or 50 miles a day. One day, as he was resting in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, he noticed Elmer sniffing in the air and acting very strange. "What's the matter, old boy?" asked Paul. "Are there grizzly bears in the woods?" In answer, the moose hound only ran forward and back in front of Paul as if urging his master to continue the homeward journey at once. For every once in a while, he would point his nose toward the sky and growl and whine in terror. Paul climbed the nearest mountain to investigate. What a sight met his horror-stricken eyes! For miles and miles, as far as he could see, the forest was afire. Great clouds of black smoke rolled upward, leaping swiftly from treetop to treetop. The angry flames rushed toward Paul. Paul never thought of himself or the danger. In the center of that raging fire was his camp on Tadpole Creek. What had happened to his men? Where were Tiny Tim and Ole and Johnny Inkslinger and all his brave crew? Had they perished in the flames? Without a thought for himself, he ran toward the raging wall of fire. Over rivers and lakes he leaped, and on through the forest, stopping only to soak his great handkerchief in the mountain lake. With this tied over his nose and mouth so he could breathe more easily, he plunged into the blazing forest fire. The smoke blinded him, and the fire burned great holes in his leather boots. On he ran through the forest fire that scorched his hands and burned his clothing. It was like a fiery furnace. At times he stumbled and fell, and the heat burned his beard to a crisp. Paul himself, Pulling himself to his feet with a mighty effort, he would stagger on. Soon he came to the blackened remains of his camp of Tadpole Creek. The great camp that covered so many acres was only a smoldering mass of ashes. The giant griddle that was the pride of Hot Biscuit Slim and all of the cooks lay in the center of the ruins. It was bent out of shape by the intense heat. In all that fire-swept country, there was no trace of his brave men. Sadly, and with tears in his eyes, Paul Bunyan gazed over the blackened land that had once been the great forest that he loved so well. His brave crew had disappeared. What had happened to them as the raging forest fire surrounded the camp? Most of all, he missed Babe, his great blue ox, who had been his companion on all of his many adventures. Although his feet were blistered with the great heat and his clothing hung in shreds, Paul went back to see if he could find Elmer, his faithful moose hound. By that time, the great forest fire had died out, and all the vast mountain country was covered with blackened stumps. Paul found Elmer with some loggers on the upper Snake River. The loggers looked at Paul in wonder. "Are you the great Paul Bunyan we have heard so much about? The man who has the largest logging camp in the world?" "I am Paul Bunyan," he said, "but alas, my camp is burned and all my men destroyed in a great fire." The loggers spoke up. "Your men are safe. We saw them escape. A great blue ox that was 100 times larger than any ox we had ever seen came through the woods. All the men followed him as he cut a path through the trees with his great hoofs. They built rafts here on the Snake River and floated down into Oregon country." Paul Bunyan cried with joy as he heard the great news. His men were safe. Burned and weary as he was, Paul laughed and shouted with joy. Elmer barked happily by his side. "What happened to Babe the blue ox?" asked Paul. "The blue ox disappeared after leading the men to safety," said the loggers. Paul lay down to rest and was soon fast asleep. It was the first night's sleep he had seen since the fire. In the morning, a soft, wet nose nudged his ear. Then a large, rough tongue licked his cheek. It was Babe, the blue ox, who had found his master. The faithful animal had searched far and near until he had found Paul. The loggers were amazed at the great sight of Paul Bunyan and his blue ox, and at the enormous breakfast they ate together. They asked Paul if he was going down into the Oregon country. "No," said Paul, "my work is over. My men can join other logging camps in Oregon. I am tired and weary, and my beloved forest is burned to the ground. I'm going to take Babe the blue ox and go up into the mountains where I can hunt and fish with my faithful dog." No more do the woods resound with the sharp blows of the 7 axemen. Tiny Tim is no longer the water boy. Hot Biscuit Slim and Cream Puff Fatty are cooking in other camps in the Oregon woods. Brimstone Bill and Ole the Big Swede were last seen in the logging camp near Bend, Oregon. They passed their later years telling of the brave deeds and mighty exploits of Paul Bunyan and of Babe, his blue ox. Paul Bunyan had disappeared from the woods. Some say he is still roaming the forest in the west. No one has seen him, but the woodsmen say the low rumbling thunder in the mountains on the summer night is Paul Bunyan calling to his faithful ox. Others say that the wind whistling through the treetops is the sound of Paul Bunyan striding through the forests as of old. The end.